We don't have much left, but I am really excited to welcome to the stage Rick Berke, who's the co-founder and executive director of Stat News, and also Kai Kuperschmidt, who's a contributing correspondent for Science Magazine, and they are going to discuss some key takeaways from today. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Do you have a preference?
Hi, everyone. We have 30 minutes and...
Looks like we have 0.
And 30 minutes between us and cocktails, and we know you're getting restless. I'm getting restless, so we're going to try to be as provocative as possible, so you'll stay in your seats until your cocktail arrives. So Kai is a perfect person for this discussion because he spent the last year as an MIT Knight Fellow right here, and his assignment was thinking about trust in science and disinformation. And he has a whole history as a journalist for science, covering various diseases and infectious, plagues and so forth for more than a decade, for many years around the world. So you've been a practitioner, you've seen it, you've studied it. So tell us what, just as we review all the sessions today, there was such a range from what would you do with $1 billion to sort of build trust in science to one-on-one communications that need to be better. What's your takeaway from, your grand takeaway from today? If you were writing this up, what would you lead the story with?
That's a good question. So let me, before I fully embrace my role as the grumpy German who at the end of the day tells you all what I've been lacking in these discussions, let me just, for like 30 seconds, I have a US partner, so I know quite well by now that I need to start with some positive before I talk about the rest. So no, I think, so first of all, thanks for inviting me. That's a gamble. But thank you very much for putting on this conference, because I do think one of the big takeaways that I had after a year at MIT looking into misinformation and disinformation was that it does come down most of the time to trust, right? You can talk all about interventions about misinformation and disinformation, but of course, if you're not trusted, it doesn't go anywhere. And so I think in general, I think it's good to have a conversation that centers trust, right? I'm really happy about that. And a lot of what I'm struck by is that a lot of the things that we talked about today ring very true to me. Also, like what Francis Collins was saying this morning about taking 10 seconds in a 30-second interview to maybe talk about uncertainty. I think that's exactly right. But I'm also struck by the fact that a lot of these conversations are exactly the conversations we could have had 10 or 15 years ago. In a world that was very, very different. And I'm not just talking about how the world has fundamentally changed in the last 1.5 months, but also about how it's changed in the last 10 years in terms of the information ecosystem we live in, right? And I would say that's the other big takeaway for me from my time at MIT was to start thinking about it. And I think Claire Wardle talked about the information ecosystem. It is an information ecosystem. You cannot start to understand what is going on if you're not understanding it as an information ecosystem. And once you do, if you have that view of it, I think you can't sit here and listen to everything that we've heard and not feel that we're missing some things. For instance, money, economics. We have barely talked about that. And my life as a science journalist is certainly impacted by business models and the question of how do we make money with good information. But maybe more importantly, we talk very little about the supply side of the misinformation problem. There is a lot of money to be made there. And it seems quite important, I think, to understand not only why people are doing this, but also why they have so much trust. And I think that goes even more when one of those people is now the Secretary of Health and Human Services in this country. So I think that these are things that we really need to also kind of like wrap into these conversations when we talk about trust. It's, yes, how do we increase trust in science, but also why do other people have trust? What are the incentives in the information ecosystem we live in? And maybe as a last thing, what I would take away from the conversation about trust, what I tell people when I talk at conferences to people who are in the infectious disease space often is, one of the big lessons from the pandemic to me was even just to realize, what is it that, if you're in public health, what is it that you're trying to maximize? I would argue that in the pandemic, the mistake, probably the reason I didn't get to ask him, but probably the reason that Francis Collins didn't take those 10 seconds is that the goal was to get as many people vaccinated as possible. That was the metric, right? Is that what you're trying to maximize in public health? Or is it trust in your advice? And the Michael Bank-Peterson experiment that Dave Rand just mentioned, that's exactly what they looked at, right? They said in a hypothetical matchup of two vaccines where one has serious side effects, if you have a hypothetical vaccine that has side effects and you have two different ways of communicating about it, one is kind of vague reassurance and the other one is kind of very explicit, these are problems. What they see is the acceptance of that vaccine goes down anyway, no matter how you communicate it. But the trust in the authority and the acceptance of the other vaccines that they're going to suggest goes up in the model where you're very transparent and honest, and it goes down if you're being vague reassuring. So I think these are the kinds of things that even just like gearing yourself towards, like it changes what you do in your job if what you're trying to maximize is trust. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, so when you're talking about sort of incentives that weren't really discussed today, like RFK Jr. and the financial incentives, what do we do about that? Like that's pretty, that's the system right now. That's the reality.
See, and this is part of my issue. I think Laurie on the other panel, or Laura, said it really well about like also telling a positive story, right? I do think we have to grapple with what the system should be. Yes, we live in the system and we need to deal with it, but we also need to think about how do we change the system, right? What are systemic changes? Because I do have the feeling that the other side has understood some of this. The system keeps changing. I was talking to Dave Rand, I think, in the corridor, and I was saying it reminds me a little bit of what's happening in politics, where it sometimes feels like, the Republicans are deciding what music is going to be played, and the Democrats are trying to figure out how to dance to the beat. That, you need to, like, how do you actually change the music? How do we actually change the system? And I think we haven't talked much about the power of some of these companies that structure our information ecosystem. But if you did a study of our information ecosystem, you would figure out that the biggest players are those, right? And so one thing, the conversations I'm having with European colleagues a lot at the moment is, let's all get away from the US companies that we don't want. There's a website that tells you European alternatives so that you're not reliant on Google Docs, but you use Proton. People move away from X. And that's where I think the really complicated conversations are, because we heard today we should meet people where they are. So I think one really interesting question that kind of like encapsulates that is, so should universities leave X? Or should they double down on X and actually talk more there? Because
what do you say? Leave or stay?
So I made a personal decision. So you can have really good arguments on both sides, I think. I made a personal decision not to post there anymore, because I think at the end, the systemic issue that I am shoring up a platform that I think on the whole hasn't really negative effects is big. And you do have to wonder, if we all increase our engagement 10% to make a better case for vaccines, and then there's somebody, and then Elon Musk sits at his desk and he can just turn up the dial on misinformation by 20, 30, 40%. I don't know that he actually has a dial, but that's basically how it works. Is that then the way to use our energy?
These are hard, if not impossible, decisions. For example, everything you say about X, many of my reporters sort of went off X.
Yeah.
But then I said, X is still Stat's #1 social driver of audience. So if our reporters aren't on X, then no one's on social going to see our stories. So I have to say, I think you should stay on X, but I understand why you wouldn't. It's really hard. What are the answers here? Now let's talk about the one thing I did not hear today, and is sort of it's the underlying theme that's the reality of why this conference is so timely, but I didn't feel the alarm that maybe is underlying everything. But you're talking about RFK. He's talking about radical transparency at HHS. So he's saying, I'm going to be transparent and trust in science. And then he's canceled meetings on immunizations. He's canceled meetings on the strains for next year for the flu. there's things being canceled. There are realities that aren't happening. So what do we do about that? And the other thing that's at the risk of being alarmist, these are realities in science right now, where one of our reporters, and I went and talked to Dr. Collins, after his talk this morning, and said, we had a reporter at the science gathering at the Lincoln Memorial on Friday. She saw this agitated protester go up to him right before his event. And she was so nervous that she went to the security and said, the guy has a bulging thing, like it's very, and they said, we're keeping an eye on this guy. So we asked Collins just out there, are you nervous for your safety? And he said, absolutely. He said, I do not, and you can read this in Stat, it just went up an hour ago on our site, but wait till after the reception. So but anyway, but this isn't, it's not funny. Francis Collins is sitting there saying, I don't know what to do. I now have security at my house out of my own pocket, but I can't afford security. Like, you didn't have security here. This guy who was beloved science, a beloved guy in science on both sides of the aisle for decades, for different presidents, is now fearing his own safety. So what do we say about that? What do we say that says about trust in science? And we said, how did this all happen? And he said, some right-wing bloggers have gone out and said, like, dishonest stuff about what he believed in and what he did with COVID. Maybe he wasn't perfect, but how do we? This is the reality in our world right now. How do we move it from the theoretical to what people here in this room can do right now?
There are a lot of questions in there. So let me take RFK Jr. first, maybe. I think to some extent we have to stop taking everything at face value that people say, right? There are certain things that we should have learned by now, and I think it's not an accident that, for instance, Wired, I think, is doing a better job of covering the new administration than, say, the New York Times, because they have seen what happened at Twitter, and they really analyzed that playbook. And the Twitter files were a kind of exercise in performative transparency that to a lot of people came across as being transparent and telling them things. And I think what RFK Jr. is basically saying is that that's going to happen at HHS. They're going to find one or two emails somewhere that somebody wrote that they can then put in a context where it sounds like it's a conspiracy, whatever it is. So I think we can point out the hypocrisy, but we also know from the last few years that pointing out the hypocrisy doesn't do much to anyone. I think to some extent the more interesting question to me about RFK Jr., one of the difficult questions that we could discuss in this room, for instance, is, so HHS is going to put money now into a study that's supposed to look into the link between MMR vaccines and autism. We know that there is no link. There's plenty of evidence. So how should scientists react to that? Because it's not necessarily a good look to say, oh, no, we don't need to study that because we already know that, right? So it's a really interesting communication challenge, I think, how to do that. And I think it goes back again to the uncertainty thing that Francis Collins mentioned, because I do think we have done a bad job in the past sometimes of explaining to people that there's a spectrum of science, and there's science that is basically, we have a really strong consensus on some things. MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism, Earth is round, like these things. And then there's other science, and the pandemic was filled with the other type of science, which was, super new, on the fly. We weren't super certain about it. And I think I think that we have, to our detriment, sometimes used what we've been told is a good communication strategy. Say there's consensus, there's really strong consensus. We know in climate change that works. Yes, but also in climate change there is a really strong, scientific evidence for it. And we have to be careful when we communicate about other things to communicate in a different way, because it's a very different type of evidence base we're working with. And so when we talk about this question of, so how do we react when he suggests a study like that, I think that is where we really need to explain why this is settled science, and why essentially it's a waste of money to do more of it, but it's going to happen. And then you kind of need to explain to people why, even if, in theory, if that study found a link, why that wouldn't even change the entire kind of the evidence base that we have is so strong that it wouldn't even matter on a scale, right? So these are the kind of things I think you have to explain. And then the other question you asked, I think it's a really serious problem. I think what you described, what happened to Francis Collins, what we've seen during the pandemic in a lot of different ways, right? This kind of, first of all, the fear that scientists have to have, the harassment we see online, particularly of female researchers, particularly researchers of color, I think it's a huge issue. And if you look, like in this example, if you look where it comes from, so often it's a complete piece of fiction, right? But again, if you talk to the people who study misinformation, I did a story on Kate Starbird at the University of Washington, who has done a lot of kind of qualitative work on how these things come about. And it is interesting, it's this kind of participatory, she describes this, it's very similar to improvisation theater. So it's participatory, there's kind of a rough storyline, a narrative, but then people can like throw in a piece of evidence, a photo, whatever, and a theory, and then that stuff gets amplified. And we were talking earlier about the fact that Jesse Waters recently on Fox News basically said that this is what is happening on the right? You have some person somewhere tweeting something, and then, it gets taken up on Joe Rogan's podcast, and then, 2 days later, it's on Fox News being discussed there. So there's a whole machinery that has been created that can, it's scary, right? It can, in a very easy way, if they target somebody, they can create a reality to millions of people that isn't real. And so I think I think we haven't grappled enough with how to answer that, but also there are no easy questions. I always feel really bad because I'm the guy who sits down and says, I think we're missing this, this, and this, and there's so many layers and it's so complex. And I was frustrated by that when I was at MIT. But at the same time, I don't have any solutions because nobody does, but we're not going to find any without grappling with all of it, I think.
But when you talked about earlier on about we need to explain this as settled science,
yeah.
And who needs to explain and how and who's going to listen? Like, we all know this. We in articles we've written about this is settled. This is not true. But it's not working. It's not breaking through. What needs to change? How does this messaging get out?
I mean, particularly when we talk about the measles vaccine, I think uptake in the US is 93% at the moment. I mean, show me one other thing in this country that 93% of people can agree on, right? There's a really strong consensus in this country on this. So I think that we also, on some of these issues, we concentrate so hard on the kind of, it is so strange to us that people can question that, like flat earthers. But that's also maybe, somebody said earlier, we have to pick our fights. Maybe that's not the fight to pick, right? There are people you're not going to convince. It's a problem with measles because you need 95% vaccination rate to have herd immunity. So we're really relying on a really high number of people accepting it. But what I'm trying to say is when we talk about settled science and the consensus, I think this is an issue where there is a path for people. I mean, most people have so far, clearly the vast majority of people listen to the scientific advice to vaccinate your kids with the MMR vaccine. And so I think that there is a path for us on this particular issue to say, look, this has been settled. But it's I'm not going to lie. I can see a conversation where people say, no, we should embrace that study and say they should do that study because there's nothing to hide, which there isn't, right? There's one, when we talk about trust, whenever I talk about trust with people, I throw this in because I can't get it out of my head. There's a really old paper by Annette Bayer from 1986, and there's this sentence in it, and it basically says, and I think that we sometimes miss this, and it says, trust is a fragile plant that may not survive inspection of its roots, even if those roots were quite healthy too before the inspection, right? I'm butchering it, but that's roughly what it is. And I think that's really perceptive, and I think that's also something we sometimes have to think about, that's where the performative transparency comes in, I think. Like, even just the fact of getting people to re-litigate something that there was never a reason to litigate creates the impression that there was something. And so we do have to also, in our armamentarium, have, as one thing, okay, no, I mean, there are certain things, it doesn't make sense. We don't have to always, when we say we meet people where they are, it doesn't mean we meet them where I mean, we still have to meet them where the evidence is, right?
When you talk about relitigating, just last week we had the FDA confirmation hearings, we had the NIH confirmation hearings, and it was a delicate dance for the both nominees, spending a lot of time saying, well, it's kind of, the science is kind of settled on vaccines, but I'm open to hearing what else there is out there, because they're trying to please their bosses. And aren't you, and I as a sort of observer of this, I'm just exhausted by this. Like, I'm thinking, like, these are people who have a lot to worry about the health of people in this country. And they're dancing around with, like, vaccines and that, like, aren't you tired of exhausted by watching that? And what are people in this audience, what are we supposed to do about this?
Yes, I'm exhausted by it. And I mean, it's going to be 4 years. Every science journalist is going to spend 4 years writing about things that, we thought we don't have to write about anymore. But that's our job. I think, yeah.
I see a couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Really quick, just shout your name and your question. And are you exhausted by what's going on here?
I am, but my name's Lee McIntyre. I am exhausted, but I'm afraid that that's what folks want.
Right.
One of the goals of disinformation is to make us cynical and to make us feel helpless. And one reason I wrote my book on disinformation is to make it clear you're not helpless. There are things you can do. There are 10 things at the end of that book that I outline that we can do. And I just want to close with, I wrote down here on my sheet so I would remember it. We're trying to look for the perfect solution here today. Everybody in this room cares about the issue. But at minimum, there's one important thing I want you to remember. It's a quotation from George Orwell. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Even if that's all you do is tell the truth, and you tell it over and over again, you have contributed to the revolution that we need.
That's a great end note. Let's go to this.
I think there's one over there too, but just very quickly, again, I'll make another plug for, getting some kind of a coordinating team together to brainstorm these ideas and coordinate across various efforts. And along those lines, could we have another meeting like this? Maybe where we spend the day talking about what you've spent the last 30 minutes talking about.
Do you want to respond?
I have time. I can come. Yeah, I mean, but in terms of, I think it is important because I don't want to end on a note of like there's nothing we can do. I don't believe that at all. I think there's a lot we can do. I think we need to think about what the strategies are that are working well. I think somebody on an earlier panel talked about, I think entertainment. I think that I really like that we talked about entertainment today because I think in the misinformation conversation, that's something that's always missing. It's not just that most people get all this misinformation. It's that most people want to be entertained and don't get any information, right? And I do think entertaining people is really important if you're going to reach them. And so I think that's something, that we can think about. And being creative about it is exactly the right approach. So there are a lot of things, but I also think coordination is important. I do. The right or the forces, the anti-science forces, have coordinated really well, and they have really profited from it. And so I think that's an important lesson for us.
And I think what Lee said is very important. Like, there's a futility here that feels like it's like we can't do anything and it's intractable. But I think you're right to be positive and to focus on ways ahead. Yep.
Sorry to add to the futility. I'm a science journalist myself, and not only are scientists being completely vilified, but so are journalists, and the jobs are gone. So in terms of examining the roots of the plant without killing it, I mean, do we have to go to better civics education? I mean, as the Department of Education is being dismantled, of course, but how do we make these changes? I mean, you talk about it's a rebellious act to speak truth. There are so few jobs in journalism, and journalists and the mass media are as much an enemy as scientists right now. So just
That's a good point. Journalists are an enemy. Scientists are an enemy. There's no money for anyone anywhere. I have
We're not going to end on a
no.
note
I'm
of
going to
fertility.
say something positive that I feel like as journalists, to speak up for journalists, I feel like for covering science and health, we have a mission. We have a mission to write credibly about what is going on. We have a mission to write about that poor Dr. Collins is like worried about his life. People need to know what's going on. They need to know the truth. They need to know about the NIH nominee who's got really a mixed record in science and is criticized by many esteemed scientists. But it's a nuanced thing. The good news is that at least I'm finding from where I sit at STAT, people are lining up to read. Our readership is going way up because people want to know the truth. There is a positive story to tell about people wanting journalism.
Maybe just to add one thing, I mean, I completely agree with you, Lee. Speaking the truth in a certain environment can already be an act of revolution. But of course, it is better if you speak the truth and there's somebody there to hear you, right? And so I do think we have to. So one of my takeaways at MIT was also every single person, most of the people I talked about misinformation were people who were studying it on the side of the individual because it's a lot of psychologists and that's what they're used to. But every single person, even those that had done all these studies, every single person I think told me that they don't think that the solution to the problem is going to be found on that level of the individual. It's going to be found on the level of systemic interventions. And that means that one of the most important things that we might be able to do is to talk about information infrastructure, like how do we build things that are not just in the interest of Elon Musk, but in the interest of an informed public. And one of the best things you can do is kind of advocate for that maybe. So I do think we need to always keep the systemic piece in our minds when we're thinking about this while we do our little piece within the confines of where we are. Yes.
So following your theme of things that were missing, I didn't hear anything about scientists' trust in the people. If you think of the greatest travesty in science communication that happened in COVID, it was telling people right away you don't need masks. That was a lie. The doctors needed masks, and we were worried that people would not obey that simple piece of information and they would go buy it. We showed a distrust in the populace. I hear your point about the roots, right? But at some point, we want them to trust us, but we don't trust them. So the measles case, perhaps it is time to recognize that people aren't stupid. We have seen, I in fact ran studies with this, where if you provide people with tax receipts, just here's where your government money went, like you spent $30,000 in taxes, here's the detailed receipt. People's support for taxes goes up, and their compliance with taxes goes up. Right? Maybe part of this is we are being elites sitting around a room and not trusting the populace. And so, anyways, that's...
Thank you. That's a really important part of it, I think. Yeah.
Let's end it there, but let me just ask one thing.
She's saying wrap it up, not go around the room one more time.
Let's go around the room. You can't have that cocktail. But anyway, but I have to ask Kai one more thing based on all your years of really thinking about this. You're talking about structures and infrastructures and sort of there's an urgency. Maybe I have a journalistic urgency. What are we gonna do now? And we can't just we could have more meetings and do all this, but the clock is ticking, and people's health is threatened. Their funding is getting cut. What is there anything that can be done to speed this up?
Is there anything that can be done to speed this up? I mean, it takes time to build trust. That's simply, if we start now, we're going to get there earlier than if we start next year, right? That's the I don't know that it helps that much to be we need something right now. The point is, we know some of the things we need to do, and we just need to actually do them. And we know that people on the other side have built over decades a machine that allowed, pretty fringe views to become, to get a lot of traction. And we should probably have thought about that 10 or 20 years ago, and we didn't, and that's the world we live in, and now we're going to have to do what we can. And one thing, I'm a journalist, you're a journalist, the thing that we do, our answer to this, as it was in the pandemic, is we write down what's happening. We try to keep people informed, to provide a record of what is happening. And then at least there's something that we can go back to, because the government is literally shutting down websites with data because they don't want the record to be there. So I think our job is more important than ever. That makes it a little bit easier for me because I feel like I do something every day. Yeah. But that goes for all of us to some extent, I think.
A great end note. Kai, thank you so much for sharing. And thank you for your thoughtful questions.